for quite a few years. When my wife and I first met one another, and again, through quite a few years of our marriage, my wife has been involved in coaching softball and just always been involved in sports, and I have as well. Years and years and years ago, my wife was coaching at the varsity level for high school here in town. And we had some friends that we had met, and a couple of them had never been to a softball game or a baseball game for that matter. So to make a long story short, we invited them. And so as my wife was coaching on the field, I was sort of sitting out down the, I believe it was it was a first base side. I was sitting down on the first base line with a couple of these individuals, and this one particular woman, as soon as a pitch was thrown and the ball was hit, the base runner began running to first base. And so the whole kind of play worked itself out, and this individual kind of leaned over to me, and I could tell she was perplexed. She had some questions. And I remember that one of her first questions was, why did that person run to this base? Why not one of the other ones? And I immediately realized just how, far removed this particular person was from the sport, in this case, again, of softball. She knew nothing of it. She didn't know the rules. She didn't know the positions. She didn't understand how the game functioned. It was all, well, as sometimes we hear say, it's all Greek to me. She just had really no idea what she was doing. I bring up that story because I think that for some of us, it's analogous to how we approach Jesus and really the Gospels, which communicate to us truths about Jesus. We don't really have any idea what's going on. We don't understand the game that's being played. We don't understand the rules. We don't understand the position. We just sort of see things happening, and we wonder, well, why did Jesus do that? Why did this person run to that base, right? We're vexed by the whole thing. Well, after our last class, when we sort of scratched the surface and looked at the Gospels in their context, we need to dig a little bit deeper this morning, and we need to try to understand something of the religious world that Jesus existed in. We need to know something of the places and the peoples that Jesus would interact with. And so that's what we're going to do during our class together right now. We're actually going to look at the religious world of Jesus. And so let me start this slideshow. There we go. So again, we're going to look at the places, and we're going to look at the people of Jesus. Specifically, when it comes to places, we're going to look at the temple, and then we're going to look at the synagogue. And then in terms of people, what I mean by that is we're going to sort of flesh out some of the characters that we interact with in the pages of the Gospels. Let's start with the temple. I've got a couple of different graphics here that I hope will prove to be helpful for you. I realize that your eyes are fixated on that temple, and I'll talk about some of those things in a moment. But before we do, just back up and recognize that at the front end, there's a vast difference that exists between, say, for example, the temple that existed in the first century when Jesus was involved in his earthly ministry, and, for example, our local churches. Now, I will grant that right now, with everything going on with COVID, perhaps your local church isn't meeting, it's not gathering, so that just sort of furthers the divide. But if you can in your mind, go back, 6-7 months ago, before our lives were kind of rocked by this virus. And think then of your church. You would generally, most people, you're a member, I hope, of a local church, of a gospel preaching church. So you're a member of that church, which means at minimum, you're going to be gathering on Sunday morning with those with whom you are in covenant, and you're going to be worshiping the triune God on the Lord's Day, on the Christian Sabbath. But by and large, that's the extent, at least, of how a lot of evangelicals, their relationship to a physical place. It's sort of a high point. There's a zip code. We go to it on Sunday morning, but unless you happen to be on staff, unless you're a pastor, or unless you're like a secretary or something like that, again, an hour, 2 hours a week on a Sunday morning, that's kind of the extent. What we have to understand when it comes to the religious world of Jesus is that the temple was not only just the center of religious life for the Jews, but it was really the heartbeat of the whole Jewish life. It was the hub of not just religious life, as I said, but of judicial life, of community life. It was the heart of what it meant to be a Jew. Now, prior to Jesus and the incarnation of the Son of God, prior to the temple that Jesus would have frequented, there was what's called the tabernacle. Now, if you are familiar at all with your Old Testament, then you will know that after God delivered his people from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh of Egypt, the people of God were brought out into the wilderness. They journeyed to Mount Sinai, and there God gave to Moses instructions for how to build this tabernacle, which, to be crass, was just sort of a mobile tent in which God would dwell. Well, that tabernacle eventually gave way to a temple. Now, we refer to this as Solomon's temple, and you can see it there on the graphic on the left-hand side of the page. This temple was really funded and planned and organized by King David, but the triune God did not permit King David to build this temple. That privilege extended to his son Solomon, who ended up inheriting the kingdom. And so Solomon's temple was built somewhere around the year 1000 BC, 900 BC, somewhere in that range. Most people date the finishing of Solomon's temple at 957. Okay, so it was a long time ago. That's when Solomon's temple was built. That temple, generally referred to in theology as the first temple, it was destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 587 BC, okay? So Solomon's temple was built in 957. It was destroyed several hundred years later by the Babylonians. And if you want to read about this, there's many places in the Old Testament in which you can read about the Babylonian captivity and sort of what that entailed. I would just direct your attention to the end of 2nd Chronicles. In our English Bibles, that's 2nd Chronicles 36. And that will lay out for you just the woes that was, the deportation of the people of God from the promised land, the destruction of the city, the destruction of the temple. Solomon's temple is no more. Following the Old Testament storyline, after captivity ended, after that 70 years of captivity that God had predicted, the people of God that were in Babylon began to return to the promised land, and they began, and this is where you find in the book of, for example, of Ezra and Nehemiah, you begin to see the people of God going back into the promised land, and under the leadership of a man, and his name is really fun to say. It's often mispronounced, and even I struggle with it. His name was Zerubbabel. Okay? Definitely name your kids names like that from the Old Testament. Zerubbabel. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, the temple is being rebuilt. Now, this temple under Zerubbabel, it's the temple that Herod essentially inherits when Roman occupation of Palestine begins. And so Solomon's temple is destroyed. 70 years later, a new temple has begun to be erected, and Zerubbabel's temple is, in a sense, Herod's temple. So as you see on the graphic here, it shows you a helpful footprint, just to give you an idea in terms of the size difference. Look how much smaller Solomon's temple is compared to Herod's temple. It's significantly smaller. This is why also when you're reading in the Minor Prophets, and after the people of God again have returned to the promised land, and they begin to rebuild the temple, you find that the people of God begin to weep, the aged among them. And you go, why are they weeping at the construction of the temple? And the reason they're weeping is because they were there to see Solomon's temple. They had dads and granddads that told them stories of Solomon's temple, of its beauty and of its grandeur. And here they are, and they see the footprint of this new temple by Zerubbabel, and it pales in comparison. It's small. It appears impotent. It appears weak. It's not a grand gesture of architecture. Well, I raise that issue because if you look at Solomon's temple, how small it is, originally Zerubbabel's temple was even smaller. What ends up happening, again, is that when Herod sort of inherits the temple, one of the things that Herod the Great was known for was for being a massive builder, okay? So this is, I don't know how old you are, for me, this would be like Tim the Toolman Taylor from that Tim Allen show back in the 90s, maybe like Bob Vila. Herod was sort of the original big builder, kind of show off his manliness or something like that. What he ends up doing with Zerubbabel's temple is in the year 20 BC, so we're still a couple of decades before the incarnation. In around the year 20 BC, Herod begins a remodel, okay? Now, you have to understand this remodel that begins in the year 20 BC, it is not fully and finally completed until the year AD 64, okay? So do the math. That means that this project of Herod's, it lasted for the better part of 80 years, okay? So yeah, the next time, if you guys are married, or if you get older and you get married, particularly you men, the next time that your wife complains that it's taking you too long to remodel the bathroom because it took you 3 months as opposed to 3 weeks, you can think of, man, you're a good thing, honey, I'm not Herod, right? 84 years to remodel this temple, which means that Jesus, who was a faithful, law-abiding Jew, it's that temple in Jerusalem that Jesus would frequent. It was Herod's temple. And you can see here again on the graphic, just the size. I mean, again, the original temple was smaller than Solomon's. You can see now how much remodel, how much expansion that Herod does over the course of those 80 some odd years to really build this temple. It's worth pointing out, again, it wasn't fully and finally completed until the year AD 64, which means that when Jesus frequented the temple, it was still, under construction. It was still in a sort of, improvement mode. It didn't get completed until AD 64. This will become important later in class, in my class and in others. There's an important date in the Jewish world of AD 70. And that's actually when the Romans came in and leveled Jerusalem, and with leveling Jerusalem, leveled the temple. So try to put this into perspective. This temple that Herod had been working on and building for 80 4 years. It finally gets done in the year AD 64. They cut the red ribbon, and within 6 years, it's destroyed. That is an exercise, no doubt, in futility. But before Herod's temple was destroyed, it really was magnificent. It was beautiful. Let me go back to that screen. Sorry. It was magnificent. It was beautiful. We're told from sources outside of the New Testament, sources like Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian. We're told that Herod's temple was magnificent, that it was constructed in some instances by stones that were between 40 and 60 feet long. It was regarded as one of the ancient wonders of the world. There was even a rabbinic proverb that went like this: "He who has not seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building." Okay, that's what we're talking about. Let me see if I can get you another. Here's another picture of Herod's temple. This is just a different cross section. You can see the walls. You can see the different courtyards. You can see the gates. Again, this is quite an upgrade from the wandering tabernacle in the wilderness, and even from Solomon's temple, and then from Zerubbabel's temple. Herod's temple is absolutely gorgeous. Here's again another, this is sort of a reconstruction of it. If you'll notice, there are some parts of the temple that are, I don't know if you can actually see my cursor or not on the screen. I hope that it's recording it. You can see here in this portion is overlaid with gold. We are told that this was done intentionally and to the point that the temple was so beautiful that when the sun would hit it just right, today we would say you would need sunglasses, right? The way the light would shine off of that gold, it would blind you. You can also tell maybe a little bit. It's not a great picture. I don't know how, I can't zoom in. On the very top here of this portion, there were spikes, pegs on top of the temple. We live in the Tri-Cities. You know why? They didn't want seagulls making a mess on the top of this thing. So they put all these spikes to try, if it was flat, all the birds would sort of huddle there and hang out there, and then birds would do what birds do. But Herod, again, he didn't want the beauty of the temple to be marred in any way, especially by bird poop. So yeah, the temple was, again, a beautiful, beautiful structure. But there's more to the temple than just its history, and more to the temple than even its beauty. And that is, theologically, the function of the temple. And again, this is going to sort of to come back to what we were saying earlier about the temple, not the temple being not just the sort of hub or center of religious life, but of all Jewish life. I apologize once again. Let me turn that off. For all of Jewish life, this is the place where prayers were offered. This is the place where the priests served. Perhaps most importantly, this is the place where sacrifices were made. If you read the Old Testament law, particularly in the pages of Deuteronomy, what you will discover is that at the temple, what God required was that animals would be sacrificed at minimum. And so this is, not including holy days. This is not including any free will offerings. This is not including any feasts and festivals like Passover or the Feast of Weeks or unleavened bread or, none of that. This is just like a regular Monday, okay? Every morning an animal was sacrificed. And then every evening, an animal was sacrificed. Every day without exception. This is the place where blood was spilled. And again, this is the place where sacrifices were made, which means that in the economy of the Old Covenant, this is the place where forgiveness was achieved, right? This is the place where atonement was made. And then, of course, the crescendo of all of this is that the temple is the place where God dwelled. You know, we say today, we can put it somewhat crassly, we'd say God doesn't have a zip code. And that's true. God is omnipresent, for starters. God is infinite. God isn't confined by brick and mortar. And that's all true. And the Old Testament saints, they understood that. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But God did so choose in the Old Covenant to condescend in such a way where he would dwell among his people. And so under the Old Covenant, we could say that though God is eternal and God is infinite and God is omnipresent, if you wanted to know where to find God, you would know where to go. You would go to the tabernacle. You would go to the temple. This is the place that God dwells. One last comment really quickly before we shift gears with respect to the temple. And again, this is important because, again, we're going to be immersing ourselves in the Gospels, and this is the temple that Jesus visited. This is the temple in Jerusalem that the apostles were a part of, etc. Excuse me. The way the temple was structured, at least Herod's temple, there were 4 different courtyards. And so if you sort of think about it kind of at the outside, kind of concentric circles, sort of moving in closer, 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 closer. And the furthest, and I might have you can read this or see this well, but sort of the outside here, this was called the court of the Gentiles. What that means is that everybody was welcome, right? So Romans were hanging out there, Greeks were hanging out there, pagans were hanging out there. In that sense, it was sort of everybody was welcome to get within arm's reach, okay, of the temple. But if you were a Gentile, you could only go so far. So court of the Gentiles is on the outside. If we were to sort of zoom in and look at another layer, another courtyard, closer to that was the court of the women. And what was meant by court of the women was this is where Jewish women were permitted to go, okay? And so some of you feminists won't appreciate this, but that's it. You were in the ancient world. If you were a Gentile, you were on the outs. If you were a woman and a Jew, well, you could come a little closer than those dirty pagans, but you still could only go so far. So Gentiles out here, Jewish women in here, you get a little bit closer, and then you have the court of Israel, the court of Israel. This is where Jewish men would go. So again, the point is you're getting closer, you're getting closer, you're getting closer. And then finally, the closest court, and I should have said this certain, but in terms of closest, what you're getting close to is the Holy of Holies. What you're getting close to is that sort of curtained off, quarantined area where the very presence of God dwells. So you got Gentiles way out here, and you got women, Jewish women, then you have Jews, and then you have the priests. And this is where they worked, and then you are perhaps familiar that that was the Holy of Holies, and there was the holiest of holies, or the holy place, and that's where the high priest would go just once a year. He would go behind the curtain, behind the veil, and he would offer sacrifice on the Day of Atonement. So there's sort of these like concentric circles that are working. And again, this is the temple that Jesus visited. This is when he's in Matthew 23, for example, or even really in all of Passion Week, when he's sort of engaging the Pharisees and as he's sort of teaching and being questioned and interrogated. This is where it's happening. It's happening here at this temple. Let's shift gears real quick. We'll be much more brief here. There's also another place we need to understand in terms of the religious world of Jesus, and that is what is called the synagogue. The synagogue. By Jesus's time, this is really the place where the covenant community would gather, where they would worship, where education would take place. In a lot of ways, churches were sort of birthed out of the idea or the whole synagogue movement. I bring this up to you because if you're reading in Luke's gospel, in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus is permitted to, what we would say today, sort of give the sermon on that morning at synagogue. In Luke 4, remember, he sort of unscrolls from Isaiah 61 and he reads that scroll, and Jesus has the audacity to say, well, he says to them there in Capernaum, I believe it is, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing, right? And then he rolls it back up. He hands it to the synagogue attendant, we might call it today, sort of the pastor. He hands it back to the scroll back to the pastor. And it's like, whoa, right? That was in a synagogue. That took place in a synagogue. Let me just real quick, while we're talking about the synagogue, let me give you just real brief a couple of notes before I forget. You won't find the idea of a synagogue in the Old Testament. So the question is, well, what occasion birthed the synagogue? Because in the Old Testament, you have the tabernacle and then you have the temple. So where do synagogues come from? Most likely what happened is that synagogues came into existence following the destruction of Solomon's temple. So you have to understand, if Solomon's temple was sort of the main hub where able-bodied Jews would gather and meet for worship throughout, celebrating different feasts and different holy days and, culminating in the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur. After the temple is destroyed and you've got some people that are left in Israel and then most are taken to Babylon, the question then becomes, well, how do we worship, right? We're not in the promised land anymore. We don't have our temple anymore. Sacrifices aren't being made anymore. Like, where do we go from here? It's probably in that environment that the synagogues were birthed. And so instead of having a place where sacrifices were being offered, what the synagogue would have looked like, and what it looked like in Jesus's day, well, was a place that was more word-oriented. In other words, instead of it being a place where sacrifices were offered, it was a place where the law of God was studied and preached and learned. So let me give you an example. This is a pretty standard liturgy for what would take place in a synagogue. And again, this is what Jesus would have grown up with. This is Jesus's Sunday school, okay? It would begin with a confession, and that confession was probably more often than not the Shema. You find that in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That is the sort of the ancient confession of faith that encapsulates the people of God. It's called the Shema, just in passing, because in Hebrew, the very first word in Hebrew is the word listen or hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. The Lord our God, the Lord God is one. Hear, listen, Shema, right? Lend your ear. So they would recite that confession. They would offer prayers just like in a typical church today. It would also be a place where there would be scripture reading. So they would be reading from the law and the prophets. The law would consist of the first 5 books of Moses, what we would call, again, the 5 books of Moses, sometimes called the Pentateuch. In the Old Testament times, they would have called it the Torah. This was the law of God. And then the prophets, right? So whether we're talking about Isaiah or whether we're talking about Hosea, these would be the prophets. So there'd be scripture reading, there'd be prayers, there'd be this confession. There'd also be what's called a targum, Targum, Targum. A targum is essentially a paraphrase of the scripture reading. Maybe just like if you ever grew up in a church or were familiar with a church that had like children's church, every once in a while, not every once in a while, depending on the church, sometimes the pastor would kind of invite all the small children up in the middle of the service. They would kind of gather around the pulpit and he would tell them a real short little story or kind of a Bible story about Jesus or something like that. It was off the cuff. It wasn't like a quote or a reading. It was sort of just a paraphrase. That's essentially what is taking place with the Targum. And then there would be a sermon, and then there would be a benediction. And the benediction is a blessing pronounced upon the people of God. And then they would be dismissed. That's what would take place in a synagogue in the ancient world. And again, that's what Jesus cut his teeth on. This is his life. This is what he grew up doing, okay? Okay, we're almost done. It won't let me... That's it. Let me, sorry about that. Let me shift real quick to the people. And like I said, I want to be real quick on this, but I want you to have, I think it's outlined in some of your reading, and I want you to just have something of a grasp of some of the characters that we're going to meet. First of all, you need to be familiar when you're reading the Gospels with this group called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was essentially the Jewish high court. In our current system of government, the highest court in our land is the Supreme Court. You know, it's a bit anachronistic, but in a sense, that's what the Sanhedrin was. That was the Jewish Supreme Court. Unlike our Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin was composed of 70 men, that's 70 men, and they were their job was, in a sense, to oversee the religious life for the Jewish people. And so what you're going to find is that Jesus is ultimately going to be, at least from the Jewish perspective, tried and convicted by the Sanhedrin, by the Jewish high court, by their Supreme Court. Speaking of the Sanhedrin, another individual that you need to be aware of is the title of high priest. High priest. The high priest occupied the highest religious office in the land. His job was to oversee priests. So when you're talking about the high priest and when you're talking about the life of Jesus, as we look at it in the Gospels, you need to be aware of two high priests. Now, that's not technically true because the law permitted only one high priest at one time. There's, like in our land today, you don't have two presidents. There's only one. But like in our land, just because someone isn't currently occupying that office, we still refer to them with that title. So we might refer to President Obama. We might refer to President Bush or Clinton, right? Well, those men are not currently occupying the office of president, but we still refer to them as president, even though right now, currently, our president is Donald Trump. I bring that up because when you get in the Gospels, you're going to be confronted with two different high priests. You're going to be confronted with a man named Caiaphas, but you're also going to be confronted with a man named Annas. And both are called high priests, and that creates a problem because, again, there is only one high priest. So are we to assume that the gospel writers got it wrong, therefore the scriptures are not inerrant, and therefore if they got the whole high priest thing wrong, maybe they got Jesus wrong, right? So we go down this slippery slope. I mean, is this whole thing just garbage? No, not at all. The actual technical high priest was Caiaphas, during Jesus's trial. What we have to understand, though, is that the high priest that preceded Caiaphas was Annas, and Annas was Caiaphas's father-in-law. And during the time of Jesus's trial, Annas, the former high priest, he still had a lot of clout. He still carried a lot of weight. And he was still referred to as a high priest, though technically he wasn't the high priest, in the same way that we would today refer to President Barack Obama, even though he technically is not our president right now. Okay, so be aware of the Sanhedrin, be aware, not beware, be aware. Be aware of the Sanhedrin, be aware of the high priest. Also, we're going to meet some scribes. Now, when I hear the word scribe, I just tend to think of somebody who scribbles. Now, maybe that's just me. Scribes in the New Testament, in the gospel era, we might better call them teachers. We might even call them lawyers. And you'll read Jesus's interaction sometimes with the lawyers or a lawyer. That's not a lawyer like we think of lawyer, like, oh, I got into a car accident, my neck hurts, I need to contact a lawyer. That's not who Jesus is interacting with. These were essentially men who were trained in the understanding of the law of God. Again, it's anachronistic. We might think of these guys as seminary professors today. These are sort of the guys that are supposed to know the Bible, okay? That's who the scribes were. You've also got the Sadducees. There's the old joke about the Sadducees. Maybe you heard it before. The Sadducees are sad, you see. And the question, well, why are they so sad? Why are the Sadducees sad? The Sadducees are sad, the joke goes, because they denied an afterlife, they denied the resurrection, they denied angels. In a lot of ways, the Sadducees, we might say, were kind of more, again, kind of in the liberal wing of the day. These were upper class aristocrats, they were priests, they were very sympathetic to the Roman occupation. In terms of scriptural kind of authority, they only affirmed the Pentateuch or the Torah. They had a very kind of a limited canon. And again, it's all anachronistic. We're 2,000 years removed, but this would be sort of a liberal wing of Christianity. They deny a lot more than they affirm. Let's put it that way. The other group, sort of their rival in the New Testament, would be the Pharisees. And of course, the joke with them is they're not fair, you see. These are sort of the dubbed, whether rightly or wrongly, in Christianity. You think of Pharisees as sort of the legalists, right? These guys who kind of cross T's and dot I's. And that's not entirely untrue. Jesus said of them, actually, in the Gospels that, these guys will strain out the gnat but swallow the camel, right? They're so fixated on this one little thing that they miss the bigger picture. The reason that they're sort of the counterpart to the Sadducees is because while the Sadducees were this kind of upper class, kind of composed of aristocrats and priests, the Pharisees, by and large, were a group of what we would just sort of call middle class lay people. As I said, they were strict adherents to the law of Moses, but also to the traditions. And we'll talk about that, for example, when we get into Mark 7 and Matthew 15. In a sense, they elevated the oral traditions and put them on par, and in some cases elevated them even beyond the actual word of God. So yeah, this is again how they get this sort of flavor of being the legalists. It's also worth pointing out when you're talking about the Pharisees that that their word probably, there's not complete consensus here, but the idea, the name Pharisee, it probably means to communicate something like separatists. So they sort of pull back, they withdraw, they want nothing to do with sort of the wider culture, because again, the wider culture isn't godly enough, they're sinful, they will defile them, you get the flavor. It's in that vein that we also meet a group called the Essenes. The Essenes, they were basically Pharisees on steroids, okay? They took the whole separatist movement to the next level. They looked at the Pharisees like they were JV, and the Essenes were like, we'll show you how to do varsity. So the Pharisees, they lived in the city, they lived in Jerusalem, they did what they had to do. The Essenes, they regarded the whole system as corrupt. They said, you want to be separatists, this is how you do it, right? So the Essenes are those who move out of Jerusalem. They sort of live in caves. They're sort of a nomadic people. They want nothing to do with the temple. Again, they're done with the whole thing. We might think in our day, unfortunately, these would be like, I don't know, super strict fundamentalists that, yeah, they're in the world, but not of the world. And they don't really want to be in the world, right? They're just, I mean, they're in their own compound. Yeah, it's sort of that flavor. Then you have a group called the Zealots. Those previous groups, when you talk about Sadducees and Pharisees and Essenes, these are by and large religious groups. The Zealots were more of a political group. They were not fans of the Roman occupation. They were not willing to go along with Herod and Caesar and sort of these impositions. So they often would do whatever they had to do to resist what they perceived to be a tyrannical governmental overreach. We might think of them in some sense, again, trying to draw some connections. They might be like ancient Robin Hoods. They were fine to rob and steal and pillage and even kill Roman soldiers, because again, in the mind of the Zealots, they didn't think that the Romans belonged there. This was not their land, and they were fine with using extreme forces of violence to get their way. Again, the risk of making a political statement, we might think of them as, an Antifa type of organization today. They're willing to do whatever they have to do to have their way. Lastly, you only meet this group one time, I think, in all of the Gospels, but I want to point them out. They're called the Herodians. The Herodians. This too, like the Zealots, is a political movement, but again, they're sort of the counterpart to the Zealots. The Zealots were vehemently opposed to Roman occupation. Excuse me. The Herodians actually supported the Roman occupation. They were quick to make bedfellows with Rome and really with Herod, hence the name Herodians, because hey, it would help line their pockets and give them sort of political prowess and those types of things. So I hope this helps as we're reading the Gospels together, as you're reading through the Gospel of Mark. You've already been introduced to some of these different players and individuals. You've already, I think by the time this video airs, you will already have been confronted with the temple and the synagogue and these types of things. And so I hope this gives you some help in trying to sort of get the lay of the land. I'll see you guys next time.